Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in Washington State. I'm Brett Davis, Washington State editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we will be discussing a new database compiled by the organization Do No Harm that found thousands of minors were subject to some form of sex change procedures at hospitals and medical facilities across the country. Political Action Committee Let's Go Washington was fined $20,000 by the PDC for campaign finance violations. Seattle's minimum wage is going up to almost $21 an hour next year, and Spokane County needs a new jail, but the mayor says the county has been less than responsive to her. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Brett Davis.
Do you care about school spending, classroom curriculums, and transparency policies in education, but find it hard to cut through the partisan noise? The nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news reporting on education through Chalkboard News. We're talking news without spin. Franklin brings fact-based news that makes sense to everyday parents, teachers, and readers who have skin in the game. By donating to Franklin, you can help American families and communities receive the education-focused news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Brett Davis. Now let's dive into the headlines. Do No Harm, an association of medical professionals, just released a new database that has revealed more than 13,000 minors received gender-affirming care of some sort between 2019 and 2023. Washington State and Seattle's Children's Hospital figure prominently in the database. Investigative reporter TJ Martinell has been looking into the data. I imagine a lot of people will be shocked at some of these figures. First of all, where does this data come from and what does it show? Can you give us an overall rundown on the numbers?
Yeah, so the data released is from a nonprofit called Do No Harm. It's a group of physicians and other medical professionals that are concerned with harmful practices being allowed within the medical profession today. So what they looked at is data from 2019 and 2023, and this data was derived from a variety of different sources, including privately purchased data from healthcare data brokers. And they looked at two separate things. They looked at the use of puberty or hormone blockers on underage patients, and then there's gender reassignment surgeries. And that there's a long list of different things that qualify as a surgery, but some hospitals like Seattle Children's Hospital do not perform certain types on people under the age of 18.
Now, I understand from this report that nearly 40% of such procedures were performed in just 4 states, California, New York, Ohio, and Washington. Is there any particular reason, it was concentrated in those states, including Washington?
I mean, Washington State has been at the forefront of promoting this stuff. Seattle Children's Hospital has its own gender clinic where they perform these procedures, and that gender clinic also partners with the hospital's autism center. So they had one thing to note is it was one of the top in the nation, but it was not the top surgery center in Washington State for performing surgeries. It performed 50 surgeries on minors between 2019 and 2023, but it performed far more, or it prescribed far more puberty blockers to underage patients.
All right. Now, one question I had reading the story, or stories, I should say, you've written multiple stories on this. What's the cost of this, and who's paying for these procedures? Where's the money coming from?
That's actually a really good question. The Do No Harm is looking into breaking out that data. It's very possible that taxpayer dollars played some role. But there's also nonprofits that are willing to pay for this kind of stuff. And there's also patients who can pay out of pocket.
Are there any actual, dollar figures associated with this?
Yeah, so there was a total of $1.4 million was billed for these services at Seattle Children's Hospital alone. I believe there was roughly $7 million in Washington State total billed during that 4-year period.
Now, I imagine this was something that was probably a little bit difficult to write about. What was it like writing on this topic? This is probably not your usual topic, but I know it's been in the news a lot lately. It's controversial and sensitive. How have you dealt with writing about this?
If it's all the same to you, I'll go back to writing about our state's transportation electrification efforts.
something a little less heavy. No.
Right. I think the issue or the question is going to be, one thing that I did note in the data is that the amount of prescriptions dropped significantly in Washington State from 2022 to 2023. And one person I interviewed for the story speculated that the COVID lockdowns and kids' increasing use of electronic devices and the internet as a way of socializing kind of led to a lot of them feeling like they had gender dysphoria. And now that the lockdowns are over, it's going to go down, but we're going to need more data before we can really see a long-term pattern going on.
Right. Not that you necessarily looked at this in doing this story, but is this do you have any reason for why this rate of transgender declaration seems to be going up? I mean, is it a social contagion? Is it people just trying to get with what's hip and what's, popular? Or it just seems odd that it would shoot up the way it has in the last several years. Is there an explanation for that?
Especially in Washington State, the education curriculum and teachers, educators, we've seen numerous cases of them trying to convince students that they are in the wrong body, that they were born in the wrong body, that they if they want to transition, whether socially or physically, there's a lot of encouragement on that. I've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence, but it's very much something that you can do, and the education system and a lot of adults in your life will view that positively. Whereas if you were to come out and say that you believed in something that's very controversial, you're not going to get that same support. So I could see where a kid who's not getting a lot of support or encouragement in their life, or is just having, social problems, where that could be a very tempting thing to do or say.
All right. It's my understanding you're writing multiple stories on this topic. How many more stories do you have coming out on this in the near future? Or an estimate, I guess. You probably don't know exactly at this point, but
it depends on what the data shows. If it doesn't show anything on certain things, there's no story. But one of the things I am looking at is a surgery center in Washington State that was the top for these minor gender reassignment surgeries. That is just recently settled a lawsuit with the state attorney general and is currently facing a separate lawsuit.
All right. Well, thanks for keeping us up to date on this important story. Thank you so much. Political Action Committee Let's Go Washington, the organization behind several initiatives on the November ballot, has been fined $20,000 by the Public Disclosure Commission for what it says were campaign finance violations. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson has been covering the story. Carlene, can you give us some details on the fine, half of which could end up being suspended, I understand, and the campaign finance violations the PDC says Let's Go Washington committed?
Yeah, so the decision came down yesterday from the Public Disclosure Commission following the hearing, which was, 3.5 hours a week ago, Thursday. So as you mentioned, the fine was $20,000, $10,000 of it is suspended, assuming that Let's Go Washington is able to satisfactorily comply with additional requirements from the PDC. So the gist of the four different allegations against Let's Go Washington had to do with that when they file documents in a timely way, saying, okay, we're paying $1 million to thus and such group to go gather signatures for us. Well, they got all of those reports in on time and as required by the PDC. The issue came in, and after those were submitted, the PDC came back and said, well, okay, so but you've got 6 different initiatives. This was in 2023, right? Where they had all 6 of them they were gathering for. PDC came back and said, well, we want to know who's gathering for what. So Let's Go Washington came back and said, well, they're all gathering for all of them, which is what their initial submissions noted, that we're going to hire these groups and they're going to, do 1 through 6. They're going to gather signatures. And anybody listening to this or, our readers have noted a lot of times there were, one guy standing outside Fred Meyer who had, you signed all 3 or all 6 on the same day, right? The ultimate issue, Brett, was that PDC said, we want to know who your sub vendors are. So say you've hired, Joe Schmo to go out and gather signatures for you. Well, then did Joe then go out and hire, Wendy, Sally, Susie to gather signatures? Well, Let's Go Washington said, we have no knowledge that they're using sub vendors. And that was the crux of what the violations and the ultimate findings against them were, saying, Let's Go Washington, you should have known who these sub vendors for your hired vendors really were.
Right. Now I understand Let's Go Washington disputes the PDC's findings, and they claim that the PDC changed the rules of the game, so to speak. So what exactly is their point of contention?
Yeah, they said we submitted all this stuff and then you came up with some brand new requirements for us. Midway through one of the reporting deadlines, Hallie Balch, who's a communications contact at Let's Go Washington, she says, we submitted everything that we believe. And then all of a sudden they came back and said, well, now we want reporting on your sub-vendors. Well, as came out in the hearing a week ago Thursday before the PDC Commission, there were attempts by Let's Go Washington to go back to their vendors and go, okay, were you guys using any sub-vendors? In some cases, they just didn't get a response. Some of the guys they hired said, we don't have to submit that to you. We've never been required to do that before, right? Maybe they don't want to reveal who some of the people are that they're working with, or they're not. And that was ultimately what Let's Go Washington said. They said there's absolutely zero evidence on any email chain, any phone calls, anything submitted that any of our vendors used sub-vendors. So now PDC has kind of come back and said, okay, tit for tat, we're going to come after you guys.
Now, didn't PDC say something to the effect of they were just basing this on belief as opposed to, any actual proof?
Yeah, there was one email that was brought up during the hearing, Brett, that was between one of the investigators from the PDC and one of the vendors that was hired by Let's Go Washington. And that kind of went back and forth. And there was a question like, are you using sub-vendors? And it kind of went back and forth. There was no answer, half an answer, whatever. That investigator from PDC brought that up in the hearing and said, well, I took this to mean, that they were in fact conceding to using sub-vendors, but there was no actual admission or acknowledgement of that, but that was their evidence, so to speak. And ultimately it must have convinced enough of the members of the commission, such that they slapped the $20,000 in fines, 10,000 of which is, suspended at this.
So you hinted at earlier, it looks like Let's Go Washington is going with the notion of turnabout as fair play by filing legal complaints against 6 organizations based on that, quote, belief, end quote, standard. So, can you tell us what 6 organizations those are?
Right. So this last week, PDC went and said, okay, so if in fact you're accusing us of using sub-vendors, even though there's no proof of that, now these 6 organizations that are fighting all of the initiatives, right? The No on 2109 committee, the Defend Washington folks, which is kind of an umbrella group fighting all the initiatives. What they're saying is, okay, we know these guys have got other groups that are unnamed in Public Disclosure Commission filings and reports. So now if you're accusing us of doing it, we're saying they did it too. And you better hold them accountable as well. So they filed their, Let's Go Washington filed the complaint this week against Defend Washington, the No on 2109 committee. Those 2 groups, I reached out to both, who I've spoken to on many occasions. Neither replied to my request for comment.
I was just going to ask if there had been any response from any of those organizations. You got ahead of me.
No, they didn't. Not even a reply, which is unusual, I have to say, because I have spoken to Sandeep Kaushik with Defend Washington on multiple occasions. And I texted him and emailed him this week multiple times saying, what do you say to this new complaint? No response as yet. So the other 4 groups are Balance the Tax Code, Help Our Kids, which is sponsored by Civic Ventures, Civic Alliance for a Prosperous Economy, and the No Tax Cut for the Super Rich. And so these groups,
subtle name.
I think maybe you could read something into that, right? So basically, Let's Go Washington says, you're going to come after us. We're going to get fined. You're going to say we're in violation. So if we are, then they are as well. And so this will be very interesting with less than 4 weeks till the election. Oh, man.
And speaking of the election, Let's Go Washington, of course, is well known for the initiatives that are on the ballot this November 5th. Can you describe what those initiatives are for people?
Right. We've got the repealing the state's capital gas tax, that's a gains tax. So many tax issues here. 2109, getting rid of the Climate Commitment Act. That's 2117. And then adding the opt-out provision when it comes to the long-term care payroll tax. So that's 2124. And then outside of that, you've got the Building Industry Association of Washington that has Initiative 2066 to ensure natural gas as an energy choice. So you'll have 4 initiatives on the ballot, and they're going to mail those out, on the 18th. So we're going to start getting those ballots in the mail before too long here.
All right. So this will come to a head November 5, if not sooner. So it'll be interesting to see how those other organizations, those other 6, if they indeed respond at all before the election, or if they just batten down the hatches until then. Thanks, Carlene. Seattle's minimum wage will increase to $20.76 an hour next year. The Washington Hospitality Association has some misgivings about the hike, saying it could hurt the restaurant industry through cutbacks and cost spikes. Western Washington reporter Spencer Pauly has been following the story. So, Spencer, why is Seattle raising its minimum wage next year? Can you explain the details of why they're doing that and how tips figure into that?
Yeah, well, it's pretty standard for Seattle and a lot of these cities to set their minimum wage for the next year. It's always a review process in seeing what is the most appropriate minimum wage. Starting next year, the city will have the highest minimum wage in the country at that $20.76 minimum wage. Now, Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell said that the reason why it's jumped up so high is because that this will boost the local economy and put money in workers' pockets. In turn, these workers will spend more money into the local economy. But the bigger issue about this new minimum wage is that it kind of ceases a tiered system that the city already had. This is a big change for a lot of smaller employers, including your small restaurants and whatnot, who a lot of people frequent to here. So how this current tiered system works is that your small businesses that employ less than 500 workers can pay their employees about $17.25 an hour, as long as they pay $2.72 per hour towards medical benefits, or if that employee earns about $2.72 per hour in tips, which majority of them do, I can say. So that's kind of the big change there, because that's a huge jump for, labor costs for some of these small employers. Right.
So now, as you mentioned, Mayor Bruce Harrell, he seems confident that this minimum wage hike will benefit the local economy. But you spoke to someone from the Washington Hospitality Association who is less certain. What does he say is going to be the impact of this wage hike?
Yeah, so I spoke to Washington Hospitality Association CEO Anthony Anton, and he told me that restaurants are already experiencing profit margins lower than the national average. And so this new minimum wage increase will just result in more expensive items for customers. You'll see reduced hours of service and then just less hours for employees to work. You have your full-time employees, they'll probably get cut to 25 hours or, even less. In the worst case scenario is a lot of these businesses who are already struggling to make ends meet and get, have profit will just start going out of business, closing down or moving out.
Right now, has the mayor said anything about this? It just seems like it's pretty obvious if you increased, labor costs, that this could have a negative impact on already struggling restaurants in the city. What's been his reply, if any, to this concern?
He did acknowledge the impact that this will have on the small businesses and, your small restaurants. The thing about it is that he said he's going to create a kind of task force full of stakeholders to figure out a way to solve this and help out these small businesses. But there are no details of this plan. And I asked Anton about this. I said, has he reached out to you all yet? And he said no. And so Anton said, unless there's any action being put in, it's just words from Harrell about what to do to help these small businesses.
The dreaded task force. Yeah. So now, in speaking to this individual from the Washington Hospitality Association, did he have any hints for restaurants to deal with the upcoming price hike?
Long story short, cut your losses. It was pretty unfortunate to hear. He said, "Don't stand." He says it's hard for to tell these businesses to do anything proactive. You can't stand idly because, quote, no relief is coming. So what the Washington Hospitality Association is now telling these businesses to do, if they want to stay in business in Seattle, is to maybe consider dropping tips, having just employees work for the $20.76 minimum wage with no tips added. Ironically, this is heavily opposed by customers, from what he told me, and employees as well, because they rely on those tips. Because they do make a lot of money in tips. He told me about $20 per hour in tips alone, on top of the minimum wage. So, it pays to be a server out here, but when you start making less hours with this minimum wage increase, who knows? Another way that the restaurants can maybe adapt is by just limiting their labor costs cutting positions. So, some people who might be moving here and looking for a quick and easy job to get started, opportunities might be slim now just because.
Now, have any of those things happened during past minimum wage hikes that you know of, or just looking in the past to see what's happened, maybe you can predict what's going to happen in the future?
I can tell you anecdotally, I've seen some of the businesses around me cut their hours. There's a place by me that used to open at 11 in the morning. So around my lunchtime, I would go over and get something. They moved to 4 p.m. So they're only open for dinner hours. That's just something I've seen. And I've seen a lot of places just come and go in my neighborhood here in Seattle. You have your restaurants open, you don't see a lot of service, and then next thing you know, give it a year, it's gone and something else replaces it. There's always turnaround here.
Sounds a bit unstable.
Just a bit, yeah. We'll see how it happens with this minimum wage increase, and we'll see if Mayor Harrell does anything to help, provide any kind of relief. But from what I'm hearing from the Washington Hospitality Association and the lack of response from the city, who knows?
All right, so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in Seattle over the next year, especially with regard to restaurants. So I predict more stories like this in your future, Spencer.
Thanks, Brett.
All right. Spokane County needs a new jail, and the mayor of the city of Spokane, Lisa Brown, says she's ready to meet with the county to discuss getting that done. However, she says that the county hasn't responded to her. Eastern Washington reporter Tim Klauser is on the story. Tim, can you give us some background on how the situation came to be? Why is a new jail needed?
Well, Brett, Spokane County has two jails. One downtown, which was built in 1986, and another out towards the airport called Geiger, which was built in 1959. Both facilities, as you can tell from the age, are pretty old and pretty outdated, but the downtown jail specifically is struggling a lot with capacity. Over the last few years, the jail has spent more and more time on a red light status, which is similar to like a no vacancy sign that you would see at a hotel or a motel. Mm-hmm. The other week, it was at 40% over capacity. While that fluctuates day by day, regardless, they're usually quite a bit over their designed capacity. And there is more space out at Geiger, but only certain inmates qualify to go there. And due to capacity issues downtown, there's just not a lot of room to move inmates from one facility to another. And last year, voters did have a chance to pass a tax increase that would have paid for a new jail, but it would have cost approximately $1.7 billion over 30 years. And they even said that probably wouldn't be the total cost.
So they're not just a little bit overcrowded, they're a lot overcrowded.
Yeah, they're definitely struggling with capacity, and Detention Services has told me the only way they really see to mitigate that would be building new facilities. But ultimately, that tax proposal failed last November, with more than 60% of voters opting against it.
All right. Now, I understand Mayor Brown sent a letter to the county right after being sworn into office as mayor. She noting her intentions to collaborate on a new jail measure. Has there been any response to that?
Well, the Board of County Commissioners discussed Mayor Brown's letter once or twice in public meetings. Specifically, they talked about a potential response, asking for more feedback and more specifics around the mayor's proposal, but they never actually got around to sending a response. Now, the county commissioners PIO did tell me that two commissioners reached out personally to Mayor Brown to meet about the jail, but they never got a response from her. Now, Commissioner Al French, he told me that he was one of those two commissioners alongside Commissioner Josh French. They said they tried to reach her several times with no luck. So I asked the mayor about this, and she said, to me, it seemed very closed doors and behind the scenes. So she didn't feel it was appropriate to respond, and stated that she prefers more formal communications, rather through those letters like she sent at the beginning of her term, as well as regular meetings with the chair of the Board of County Commissioners, Mary Cooney. But the PIO told me he wasn't sure if they had had any conversations regarding the letter or the jail initiative.
All right. And as I understand things, politics might be factored in a bit here. So as I understand things, French's last victory, for office was in 2022 over Maggie Yates, who served as the county's regional law and justice administrator. And Yates is now Brown's deputy city administrator. And she was open about not supporting the jail expansion measure you mentioned earlier. Do I have that right?
Yes, you do. Yates ran against French's reelection in 2022, but ultimately lost. And during that campaign, she had stated publicly that, she was against a new tax measure to fund a new jail. She thought it wasn't a good use of taxpayer dollars. But in her campaign, it's notable, she was backed financially by Mayor Brown when she was then director of the State Department of Commerce, as well as by Fuse Washington, which is a liberal activist group. A few weeks ago, Fuse Washington, along with some other partners, pushed for a recall effort to pull French from office. Now, the courts ultimately threw that out, but it was quite interesting that, the mayor didn't talk to me about her direct involvement due to city policy.
Right.
But regardless, she helped back Yates. The Fuse Washington, who backed Yates and backed Mayor Brown during her own mayor campaign, they're both backing French's current challenger, Molly Marshall, in the upcoming re-election in the general election next month. So
it's a bit of a tangled web there.
Yes.
So what happens next? Is the county actually any closer at all to getting a new jail?
Well, they seem to talk about it a lot, but it doesn't seem like there's actually any concrete movement. Now, both parties, the county and the city of Spokane specifically being the biggest entities in the region, they need to get together and talk about what this new measure would look like for each of them. And they also need to, consider the other cities. There's Medical Lake, there's Liberty Lake, there's all these other surrounding municipalities that use the jail too, that also help fund its annual operations. But regardless, it'll likely be a decade or so until the county could even build a new jail if they're able to pass a sales tax. So if that happens 2 years from now, we're at least looking at 8 to 10 years until they can get that jail built. And it's still going to be decades until they can finish paying for it.
It seems like the sooner the better would be the way to go, given that I don't think the jail overcrowding situation is going to improve.
Yes, that is what the county's detention services and some of the Spokane City Council has been calling for. But they just need to get together and figure it out. But right now, it doesn't seem like there's much movement.
All right. Well, on the plus side, more stories for you, Tim.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. A big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Brett Davis. And until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.